Good evening, everyone. My name is Eka Ikpe. I'm the director of the African Leadership Center here at King's College London, and I'm also Reader in Development Economics in Africa. It is my honor to welcome all of you, both those of you here who are with us physically and those of you who are online with us to King's Africa Week 2024. It's an absolute delight that this is the sixth one in the series. And we have here our second keynote event for Africa Week, and that is a high-level panel discussion on the role of multilateral organizations in projecting Africa's agenda on the global stage. Now, this keynote event responds to this year's Africa Week theme, Owning Agency, Africa's Future and Evolving Path in the World. So as we come to, we're nearing the end of Africa Week. The week actually ends tomorrow. As we come to the end, I'd just, like to note that we've had a very exciting week this year, where we've had incredibly fascinating and compelling conversations through several panel discussions. Through some debates we had in the first keynote event of the week. We've also had very fascinating exchanges through exhibitions and some performances, as well as film screenings. And we've had participation from across King's College London, from all the faculties of the university. I am, of course, also very pleased to note that we've had participation also from our partner institutions on the African continent, in Europe as well, and the rest of the world as well. Let me note, even though this is the second and I guess closing keynote of Africa Week, we do have 3 additional events tomorrow, Friday, the 8th of March. We have a panel discussion on African elections in 2024. We also have a panel discussion on South Sudan's path to democracy and sustainable peace in a global landscape. And finally, we have a documentary film screening on creative women entrepreneurs in Lagos. So if you are around tomorrow, do please join us for those events as well. Feel free to refer to the website, www.kcl.ac.uk/Africa-week for more information on all Africa Week events. Now, this evening's event, as I noted, a high-level panel discussion on the role of multilateral organizations in projecting Africa's agenda on the global stage, will draw on the expertise and experience of leading African policy decision makers and practitioners. And we'll be examining how robust and tangible the expression of African agency has been within this global arena. We begin with an opening keynote that will set out the context within which African agency can and has been engaged by pivotal African actors and institutions, including the African Union and various citizen formations, and as well as within the United Nations system. We then call on very senior African policy actors to critically discuss the opportunities and limitations that both enable and hinder the possibilities for harnessing and deploying Africa's agency across various continental, regional, and global institutions. I'm very pleased to, at this point, hand over to this evening's moderator, the director of the African Leadership, the executive director, excuse me, of the African Leadership Center, who's based in Nairobi, Shuvai Nyoni, who will take us through how the event will be formatted, and she will also introduce our speakers this evening. So I'll hand over to Shuvai Nyoni, please.
Thank you very much, Eka, and good evening to you all once again. It is a pleasure to have you with us for tonight's or this evening's conversation, and we really hope it will be a conversation, and we will have various people, as Eka has mentioned, who will be helping to stimulate that conversation and that debate. Just by way of sharing how this evening will run, we will have an opening keynote by Madam Hannah Tete, who I will introduce very shortly. After that, we will have a few minutes because we want it to be a conversation and be interactive. My colleague, Dr. Barney Walsh, will come and assist us to respond to a few questions. We'll have a very quick survey that we'll ask you all to respond to. So please have your devices ready to participate in that. We will then come to our panelists. We have two panelists, Professor Yusuf Mahmoud and Professor Adedeji Ebo, who is joining us online. And they will be responding, but also contributing to the conversation and offering their perspectives on the topic tonight. We will finally come to the room for some interventions and also questions and inputs. And then we will come to the end of our conversation, and it'll be followed by a reception or some refreshments afterwards. So you won't go away completely with empty stomachs after the conversation. So now allow me to introduce Madam Hannah Tete, who is currently the United Nations Secretary General Special Envoy to the Horn of Africa. She has served since 2019. She was the special representative of the Secretary General to the African Union, and she was the head of the United Nations Office to the UNOAU. Prior to that, she served as Director General of the United Nations Office in Nairobi. And she's also served as a cabinet minister in the cabinet of the government of Ghana as Minister for Foreign Affairs, during which time she was also a member of the National Security Council and the Armed Forces Council from 2013 to 2017. She was appointed co-facilitator in the high-level forum for the revitalization of the agreement for the resolution of the conflict in South Sudan, which was 2017 to 2018. So you will all agree with me that we have someone who is very well placed to share with us and speak speak authoritatively on this topic, but also someone who you will all find is very willing to engage and interact on the subject. So Metete, I invite you please to the podium. You're very, very welcome.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be with you this evening. First, I would like to express my appreciation. I hope you can hear me. I would like to express my appreciation to King's College and the Africa Leadership Center for inviting me to join you for the Africa Week. I would call it discussions because it's been a very interesting exchange for me so far to listen to you and at the same time to have a better understanding of maybe the way in which the work that we are doing is perceived by those who are observing and analyzing and trying to make a determination as to how useful these interventions have been. On the issue of discussing the role of multilateral organizations in projecting Africa's agenda on the global stage, I would start by saying that in order to have a more forward-looking conversation, it's important for us to think about where we are right now. And where we are right now is at a point where this year, we are going to be having a discussion during the Summit of the Future on what would be the future of multilateralism itself. That means that we are at an inflection point. The old maybe has the opportunity to pass and something new and something better can come out of it. But that is only going to happen if there is an effective exercise of exactly the topic we're going to be discussing, Africa's agency. When the UN began to prepare for the Summit of the Future, it was recognizing that the world is not on track to meet the SDGs, that the speed and complexity of developments have outpaced the multilateral system's ability to facilitate cooperation and coping, that the benefits and opportunities of progress are spread very unevenly, with the majority of the people of the world left behind. The risks and the threats are impacting the most vulnerable. And when we talk about threats such as climate, conflict, food security, weapons of mass destruction, pandemics, health crises associated with new technologies, we see that these are growing. And multilateral governance that was designed for simpler, slower times is simply not adequate to meet today's rapidly changing world. And that's why I said that we're at a position where we have the opportunity to think about the new. But what I note is that there isn't that much conversation about this summit of the future. In fact, among member states, you hardly hear it being discussed, even though it's going to be an important agenda item during the next General Assembly. So how do we talk about Africa exercising agency when this issue does not seem to yet have exercised or excited in any way our current political leadership to begin to see this as an opportunity? And that's the reason why I think that conversations like this and conversations that I hope will follow through from this will create that opportunity to see this as a chance for Africa to exert its agency, to influence what the shape of the multilateral system is going to look like going forward. But before we can do that effectively, I would also argue that there is the need to revitalize the African Union itself. Because for the last 3-4 years, it has not perhaps been as effective as it once was when it actually was exercising agency in important ways. That's not to say it hasn't happened, and I'll give a couple of examples where I think it has happened and it has happened effectively. But it should be not on an ad hoc basis. Would like to see it with some framework, some structure, some regularity, so that it is indeed known and understood that when Africa wants to shape its agenda, it will do so through its premier multilateral institution. And this is the way that civil society can also interact with that shaping process, so that the African Union does not come across as a club of heads of state that at the end of the day projects a very narrow agenda, but rather can be more representative of the continent as a whole. But when I say I wanted to start with examples of what has worked, I'd like to reference first the response to COVID, because it was one of the situations where I think we did see in a very important way that the continent came together to be able to respond quickly and to create the opportunities for engagement in such a way that it wasn't 55 countries that were working individually, but it was the continent as a whole. And I'd like to remind you that after the COVID pandemic, one of the first things that the heads of state recognized was that there was the need for the establishment of a pooled procurement platform, which essentially predicated the creation of the African Vaccine Acquisition Trust and the African Medical Supplies Platform for the procurement of the vaccines. It, for the first time, brought African governments and African private sector actors together to see how they could best use the expertise available to them to make sure that they were more proactive on how we would acquire those vaccines. Now, I hate to think what would have happened given the fact that most of the developed countries at the initial stages were grabbing all the doses of vaccines that they could. If Africa had been approaching this problem from a perspective of 55 member states, instead of within the united platform that these modalities that were established created. And so I would argue that it is a demonstration of the fact that when Africa wants to exercise agency, it is able to do so in an effective manner. Another period where I think we were able to do this effectively was in debating the successors to the Millennium Development Goals. African Union mobilized member states, but also civil society and other actors to think about what we call the African Common Position on the successor goals to the MDGs. And what that did was essentially not only ensure that Africa's priorities found themselves reflected in the SDGs, but it also ensured that in the Agenda 2063, it was indeed reflective of a common African position. And what we saw the common African position focusing on was the need for structural economic transformation and inclusive growth, science, technology, and innovation, people-centered development, environmental sustainability, natural resource management and disaster risk management, peace and security, and finance and partnerships. And if anything of that sounds familiar to you in the way in which the SDGs has been articulated, then you see what I mean when I say that the common African position was part of, I don't say it was entirely responsible, but was part of crafting what were the new priorities for the next period that we anticipated for this development agenda to be implemented. I would be the first person, as the UN has said, to acknowledge that we are way behind on the implementation of the SDGs. But that's another conversation where I think the ineffective engagement and agency that African countries can display when they come together is demonstrated, and makes the case why this has to be much more thoughtful, much more forward-leaning, much more predictable, and not engaged on an ad hoc manner. And finally, in terms of where I think we've been able to succeed in demonstrating unity of purpose and agency has been now on the most recent Security Council resolution 2719 on financing African peace enforcement operations. Now, for a number of years now, we have known that for some of the most intractable conflicts on the continent, they don't exactly lend themselves to peacekeeping operations where there is no peace to keep, where there is intrastate conflict, and where indeed that whole model is less than effective. And also for a very long time, it was incredibly difficult to get the rest of the world, especially the Security Council, to acknowledge that there needed to be the development of new instruments to be able to finance peace enforcement operations. If you think about what's happened in Somalia, AMISOM to now ATMIS, and the question about what comes next, 2719, I think, has been introduced at a time when we now have a vehicle to say that UN-assessed contributions ought to be used for funding not peacekeeping, but peace enforcement operations. Now, there's a catch to that because the Security Council said it would consider these requests on a case-by-case basis, and that 25% of the funding had to be mobilized. It doesn't say it has to come from African countries. It said it had to be mobilized by African countries. And so there is still the responsibility to try to move this along. But we do now have the opportunity to have a significant proportion of those costs funded by UN-assessed contributions. When I talk about the need for revitalization, I think that the AU chairperson in his most recent address to the Authority of Heads of State and Government at the summit in February articulated it much better than I can, and I would like to quote him, because that is to say that it is an imperative, it is not a nice to have, if Africa is going to be able to engage its agency much more effectively. The chairperson said, another phenomenon deserves your close attention: the frantic tendency to make decisions without real political will to apply them has grown to such an extent that it has become devastating to our individual and collective credibility. As an illustration, over the last 3 years, 2021, 2022, and 2023, 93% of the decisions have not been implemented. This almost systematic defiance of the decisions of your summits is perceptible at the level of the member states, as well as at the level of the regional economic communities. It's become commonplace to see them overstep or even blithely violate the decisions of continental bodies. Now, if that doesn't make the case for revitalization, I don't know what does. And so going to the next step, how exactly do we think, or do I suggest that this could happen? I think it's important to ensure that in the next iteration of the way in which the continent engages with its multilateral organization, the African Union, there should be much more emphasis on the need for high-level political leadership that appreciates the need not to just strengthen collaboration between member states as a club of leaders of states, but in a manner that allows the effective participation of citizens in the affairs of the state, so that indeed the states are acting as agents of their citizens and their collective decisions become the decisions of the continent, which will invariably have much more weight, have much more support. And in these days of social media and the ability of everyone to contribute to the conversation, would certainly generate the kind of public attention that the positions could not be disregarded, could not be dismissed, and would have to be taken into consideration. And I think that making sure that that connection happens is imperative, but it will not just happen at the level of, let's talk about how we revitalize the union. It means that we have to rethink what we mean by democracy within our nation states. Now, some of you might be familiar with a study that was done by the UNDP last year on unconstitutional changes of government. It was entitled Soldiers and Citizens, Military Coups and the Need for Democratic Renewal in Africa. And the study was based on a vast perception survey, which captured the views of 8,000 citizens across Africa. Among the respondents, 5,000 were African citizens who had lived through recent coup or equivalent unconstitutional change of government events in Burkina Faso, Chad, Guinea, Mali, and Sudan. Their views were contrasted with those of 3,000 citizens from countries on a path of democratic transition or consolidation, namely the Gambia, Ghana, and Tanzania. And with this extensive survey, the study was able to interpret issues and trends through a uniquely people-centered dataset. What clearly emerged was a decline of civic trust in government's capacity and commitment to provide inclusive development and economic opportunities. And this was especially true for younger people. In many contexts, this was accompanied by anger at issues ranging from corruption and insecurity to economic development or lack thereof and the global economic downturn. The study also noted that democracy was at an inflection point. The rise in military coups and the increasing trend of constitutional manipulation across the continent was reflective of the democratic dysfunction that has been reoccurring in some political systems. And even where democratic transitions appeared to be consolidating, there was disillusionment with the promise that the prospect of democratic governance had previously held, with the failure of some elected leaders, I would say a significant number of elected leaders, to be able to provide for their citizens' needs, to meet their aspirations, and indeed, to be able to engage their excitement and their enthusiasm in the prospect of the future for their countries. And so, if we are to make African agency much more effective, then it is important that the messages that were contained by this study have to be taken on board by our leadership. That has to be where we go going forward. Because if we do not do so, I think that we run the risk of many more unconstitutional changes of government. And we will move from flawed democracies to dictatorships without any improvement whatsoever, because dictatorships usually do not provide for significant and qualitative changes of government. And we will enter the next century, the next decades, and the crises that are in front of us with a much more unresponsive leadership. And I think for all those who profess to be Democrats, we cannot afford for that to happen. There isn't any meeting that I've talked about, that I've attended on the continent, or talking about the continent, that does not talk about the richness of our continent. In fact, it's something we bemoan all the time. And yet, one of the things that has struck me is the way in which we have not been able to use some of the mechanisms that we ourselves have created to be able to stimulate much more of that economic development. And in this context, I'm talking about the continental free trade area. The decision to have the continental free trade area was taken in 2012. We are in 2024. This is 12 years later. Trading under the AfCFTA started in 2021 with some of the member states. Many more have not adequately taken that on board and reflected it in the way in which they have changed their policies and their legislation. And why I think that this is a significant oversight, it's because creating that free trade area, eventually creating that customs union, will be the answer to Africans owning their own resources, developing their own natural resources, and doing so in a way that preferences and prioritizes Africans and African economic ownership. And so it is very much something that has to be focused on. For countries that essentially their main exports are commodities, they will not necessarily immediately see the need or understand that there are these incentives that can benefit. But that's all the more reason why the discourse and the support and the technical support that is given to these member states by the African Union to be able to implement the AFCFTA is just so critical. If we're talking about the fear that others are now going to scramble for Africa's resources in order to be able to meet the challenges of generating green energy and taking advantage of Africa's mineral resources. Well, in the event that you had the AFCFTA properly implemented across DRC, across Gabon, across Congo, Brazzaville, across the whole of the continent, that allowed for the development of regional value chains, that also allowed for investments governed by the same rules across a number of member states, would that not be the incentive to encourage further investment in developing those particular resources? And that's the reason why I come back to the point that we have to have much more inclusive governance. Because if our heads of state, if our political leaders don't see it, certainly there are Africans who see it and will be in a position to advocate for these necessary policy changes to come into effect. And that's the reason why I find the prospect of having the African public space that is being suggested by the Leadership Center, the African Public Sphere that is being suggested, to be quite exciting. Because I think that given the right structure, it will create the opportunity for that messaging to be sent, even if there are people who might not like to hear it, depending again on the partnerships and the collaboration that are around this initiative, to make sure that the voices of the majority of Africans inform African agency. Now, there are two other things that I'd like to touch on, and then I'll take my seat. One is with regard to the impact of the climate crisis, and on the continent, I do refer to it as the climate crisis. And the other is the opportunity that is provided, but at the same time, the risk, if not well handled, of Africa's membership of the G20. On the issue of the climate crisis, we know very well that Africa has contributed negligibly to carbon emissions, but that, for the purposes of responding to the challenge, I would say is irrelevant. Because what is happening is that we are very much on the receiving end of the impact of the climate crisis. The area of the continent that I cover, the Horn of Africa, and my current role is 70% arid or semi-arid. Can you imagine that? 70%, 8 countries, that is the member states of the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, arid or semi-arid. And over the last 4 years, there has been, within particular regions of this, sub-regions of this broader region, sustained drought. And so what you've seen is that within the area referred to as the Mandera Triangle between Kenya, Somalia, and Ethiopia, this has been the phenomenon. And as a result of which, it has had significant impact on the lifestyles of people who are living in pastoral communities and for whom that was their way of life. Now, I've talked about what happened in the Horn, but last year before the climate summit, the IMF prepared a paper on climate challenges in fragile and conflict-affected states. And they noted that from Central African Republic to Somalia and Sudan, fragile states were suffering many more of these climate shocks than countries that did not meet that category. And that by 2040, many of these states could face 61 days a year of temperatures above 35 degrees Celsius on average, 4 times more than other countries. Extreme heat, along with more extreme weather events that come with it, obviously will endanger human health and will affect productivity. And so when we talk about climate change and the crisis, we've got to look at it from the perspective of this is not something we deal with as an add-on. The sustainability process has to inform all aspects of government policy, whether that has to do with agriculture, whether that has to do with mining, whether it has to do with transport, whether it has to do with the kind of energy that we are adding on to our own energy supplies to be able to fuel our development. Because if we don't think about it from that perspective, and we are not more forward-leaning in this regard, what we will see is that as these phenomena become more and more frequent, and we have less and less resources to be able to deal with it, then it will impact us even more severely. There will be forced migration from these fragile states to other states. It will create problems in many other African states, and you can imagine the knock-on effect. So sustainability is not something we should be waiting to address when we finally get funding from the developed global north. Sustainability is something that we have to address as a matter of policy and priority. And that brings me to the discussion on the G20 and Africa exercising its agency through its new membership as a regional body of the G20. It's important to recognize that because the G20 is made up of countries that essentially produce 80% of the world's GDP, by participating in this without doing so in a much more focused and meaningful, deliberate and prioritized manner, we can be contributing to the sidelining of the United Nations, which is a broader forum in which we have all of the countries of the world contributing to decisions on the future, to having these discussions focused within the context of the G20, and perhaps not necessarily taking into consideration enough the continent's priorities. I think that it's important for us to bear in mind that when it comes to decision-making within the context of the G20, it is extremely time-consuming and bureaucratic, because it's not just the G20 heads of state meetings that we see happening. There are several technical level discussions that take place ahead of that. Now, given the fact that Africa is participating as a union, and therefore it will be represented by the chair of the Authority of Heads of State and Government, that is an annual rotating chair, and the chair of the Commission. And the Commission is not exactly structured in the same way as the European Union to exercise agency of its own. How do we make sure that the views of all member states are included in Africa's contributions and discussions made within the G20 framework? And how do we ensure that the views of all member states are adequately represented in order to make sure Africa's agenda is on the table? I think that it's something that requires all of our attention. And I hope that, you know, especially for those who identify themselves in the room as Pan-Africanists, that you can pick up the challenge and begin to focus on how actually this membership becomes meaningful. Otherwise, it will be token. There will be Africa sitting at the table, but Africa sitting at the table will make very little difference. And finally, I would like to end by saying that this is a very consequential year for the African Union, not because there's an election, but because there's an election next year. And literally next year in February. And literally all the positions except one are up for election of new leadership. If our premier continental multilateral organization is going to be revitalized, it depends on what kind of commission we are going to have in place after the elections in February of 2025. Now, if we elect a commission that is going to continue with business as usual, chances are that we will continue to complain about the African Union in the way in which the chairperson himself articulated, and we will not be able to exercise the agency that we all think is so necessary. But if this year becomes an opportunity to think about what kind of African Union we're going to have going forward, then of course we can begin to make a much more effective difference. So I hope the African public square becomes a reality quickly. I hope that it begins to look at how we set the agenda for the future of the Africa that we want, so that Agenda 2063 doesn't become a mere cliche, but really becomes a vision that will be realized. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much. I mean, I think you will all agree with me that that is quite the tour de force and around several issues that we could go much deeper into on this subject. And I think Madam Tete has really painted us quite a vivid picture of several things, the need to revitalize in order for us to have this louder and larger expression of Africa's agency. Some positive examples of how and where this has been done. We can debate how thick, how thin this agency is, but I think several very key issues around mindset shifts that are necessary, how we must think of agency as central to our existence as Africans, whether we're thinking about sustainability, we're thinking about climate, we're thinking even about spaces for voices, ordinary Africans' voices, and of course, how we take up opportunities and progress with these. At this point, I would like to invite Barney to help us with the survey and see if we can get some of your views and some questions related to the topic. Some of you may have changed your minds following the keynote address, but please be rest assured we will have an opportunity to hear more from Madam Hannah Tete as we continue with our conversation. Professor Mahmoud, can I invite you to take a seat even as we go through the survey? And also, Professor Ibo, please be on standby. We will soon be hearing from you. Rani, will you tell us what we need to do?
Yes, there should be just QR code, and then there's 3 questions. 2 as just a yes, no, and then there's a one that you type your beautiful thoughts. Pray to your gods, say this tech should be okay, we hope. And online, I've tried to share it to online as well. You can feel free to join in. So just give people 2 minutes.
Yeah, we'll just give 2 minutes for everyone to respond.
My colleagues who helped me experiment earlier, this is a different one. So do it again, please. Yeah. Working.
For the long question, you can even just put in one word. It doesn't have to be a whole essay or policy brief. Okay, I think people that
Let's see. Hang on, let me share it online, guys, as well. So, what's the first question?
Okay, so our first question was, do you think multilateral organizations have been useful in projecting Africa's agenda? We have 27, how many responses in total?
Still ticking.
Oh, still ticking?
2017, do the math. 40-ish.
So we have about 40 people who've
Nearly 50,
responded,
nearly 50.
almost 50 people who've responded.
Ticking.
28 say yes, they think multilateral organizations have been useful in projecting Africa's agenda, and about 20 people are saying no, they do not think that multilateral organizations have been useful in projecting Africa's agenda. So let's sit with that. The second question, do you think African multilateral institutions are fit for purpose in projecting Africa's voice? This one is almost the other way around. We have 23 saying yes, African multilateral institutions are fit for purpose, about 27 saying no. Okay, the numbers are changing as we have more, but it's about 50-50. Okay. Great. And then the last question, which was Vanya, what was the last question?
What do you think needs to change?
Yes, so the last question is, what do you think needs to change to achieve this?
Just word cloud.
So a word cloud with some of the responses. African people may need to change, Africa's approach, Africa's leadership, its institutions, its citizens, the relations. Those are some of the responses. So I think we can leave it at that, and maybe if there are additional responses, we can come back at the very end. But thank you so much for participating, everyone. That helps us to shape our conversation going forward. So at this point, I would like to invite, you would have heard as Dr. Eka introduced our panel this evening, that we have been having, if you haven't joined us for any other activities this Africa Week, we at the African Leadership Center have also had the privilege of hosting and spending time with several of our leading practitioners. We have a number of senior Africans who have been engaged in various governance, peace and security initiatives across the continent and in other global spheres who've been with us together with alumni of the African Leadership Center, spending time with students and our fellows to talk about some of the work that they're doing. And tonight is what we have the opportunity to hear from some of them and to interact with some of them. So part of our panel, we have two of those practitioners with us. We will hear from both Dr. Adedeji Ebo, who is the Director and Deputy to the High Representative, the UN Office for Disarmament Affairs. Dr. Ebo is currently the Director at UNODA. He was previously Chief of Conventional Arms Branch. He has also served as the Director of Political Affairs in the UN Office for West Africa and the Sahel. And he has also been the Director of Political Affairs in the UN operation in Côte d'Ivoire. Dr. Ebo is a visiting professor at the School of Global Affairs, King's College London, and his latest publication is titled The United Nations and Security Sector Reform, Policy and Practice. We will also hear after that from Professor Yusuf Mahmoud, who is a senior advisor at the International Peace Institute in New York. Professor Mahmoud is also a visiting professor at the African Leadership Center. He is a senior, as I said, he's a senior advisor at IPI, but he also supports sustainable development and peace operations and serving as a focal point on mediation and prevention policies and practices, which he has done also in the past. He's a former UN Under-Secretary General and has headed peace operations in Burundi, the Central African Republic, and in Chad. And if you're interested, you'll find a publication of Professor Mahmoud's that called Whose Peace Are We Building? And that was published and developed as part of the ALC Leading Practitioners series. So I will hand over to you, Professor Ebo, to speak to us for about 7 minutes, and then I'll also invite Professor Mahmoud afterwards. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, moderator, and thanks to King's College African Leadership Center for inviting me to share my perspectives. I did try to be with you, and I'm very sad that I'm not able to make it in the room. So greetings from New Jersey. Barney and Adioti are witnesses that I did try my best. It was a logistical impossibility. That's another story. I don't think 7 minutes will be enough. I'm an African who has been thinking of my frustrations for a very long time. So we'll try 7 minutes in the first instance. I'm very honored and humbled to be sharing the platform with two very distinguished Africans. And I'll have a lot more to say about them later. These are Under-Secretaries General, and those who know the ranking of the UN know that I'm not even close to being qualified to be sharing the panel with them, but I'm very grateful all the same. I want to ask for apologies in advance if I come across as being a little bit too candid. I thought that distance necessitates that I shock you a little bit. And also, given that I am the one who is the youngest of the three in Africa, this matters. It means that I can be a little bit rather more exuberant than the other two. So the first thing I want to say is that the question itself, I'm not comfortable with in terms of how multilateral organizations have been useful in protecting Africa's agenda. I don't think it's their job to be, because multilateral organizations come in different shapes and sizes. Certainly, they are the mirror, the reflection of the constellation of states, both economic and political, that form them. So you wouldn't expect, for example, the same delivery from United Nations, which is global, from, say, compared to, say, the African Union, which is more inward-looking and continental. So each of these multilateral organizations are simply mirrors. What we get out of them is a bit like a bank account. Depends on what we put in them, and what we put in them depends on how politically or economically resourced we are. Which takes me to my next point, which is that if we take the United Nations, and I see it, we are all from the UN, three of us who have been invited, I would imagine that first we need to be candid to admit that multilateralism in that global context is based on a particular political economy. And in that political economy, Africa has a particular role, I would argue a marginalized role, which you can trace to history, to structures, and so on. And that is actually what African agency is to work hard to transform in its favor. I'll further say that, fortunately, the hegemonic order that this political economy has produced, fortunately, is in decline. Some will say it's actually in disorder, it's chaotic, which makes it rather currently weak ripe for change. But unfortunately, Africa's own agency to take advantage of this opportunity is not very encouraging, because African agency is dissipated, it is weak. Reading Fumi Olunishaken's paper that was presented, I think, on the 4th of March, she does admit that it's largely either sold or hired to different extents. So Africa is not able to take advantage of this weakening hegemony. I think regardless of which multilateral organization, even the SG, Secretary General of UN, has admitted that multilateralism is failing generally. And I quote him when he says that inequalities and injustices within and among nations are giving rise to new grievances. They have sown distrust. They have sown distrust in the potential of multilateral solutions to improve lives. And therefore, it calls for a new multilateralism. Madam Tete spoke about how the benefits of multilateralism are unequally distributed. So, first point, Africa itself is losing faith in what the global arrangements can deliver to it. But I think perhaps more frighteningly, more interestingly, is the fact that Africa itself, within Africa, Africans are increasingly losing faith in our construct. If you look at ECOWAS, you look at the African Union, Madam Tete talked about all the deficits. African economic communities in West Africa in particular, are struggling with political cohesion. Some states are leaving. Others are calling them back. It's not a very pretty picture. So before we go to the global picture, level, both the sub-regional and the continental in Africa themselves are not connecting. So we are not in a very good place with multilateralism. Now, in terms of the second question that was posed, do you think African multilateral organizations are fit for purpose in protecting our voice? I think it's not a linear picture. African institutions have delivered. You think about ECOMOG in West Africa, you think about IGAD, they have at one point or the other delivered on our expectations. But however you want to characterize them, we have to admit that they are essential elements in African agency that should be able to connect the continental level to the national level. So they need to be able to perform that role of interconnecting various levels of agency. But having said that, the truth is also that these are often elite-based, state-based, and there is therefore a legitimacy gap in the sense that state-based and elite-based African agency do not always reflect the voices of the communities and the people on the ground. The importance of that, I think, is that if societies are existing not because of state agency, but in spite of it, then it means that agency is not legitimate. And if agency is not legitimate, agency cannot be impactful. If it is not impactful, it cannot be sustainable. So the legality gap, the legality legitimacy gap is one that is defining agency in Africa and by Africa. And I think that the challenge that we face is how to narrow the gap between legality and legitimacy, the tension between legality and legitimacy, the tension between people and human-centered agency and state and elite-centered agency on the other hand. I think that at the end of the day is the task we need to perform. What do I think needs to change? I think we need to transform African agency. It has to be transformed from being state-centric and elite-based to a more inclusive, people-centered, human-centered, if you like, pact that links each level of agency from the community to the state, from the state to the regional, from the continental to the global. If there are disconnections at any point of these concentric circles of agency cannot be, in fact, impactful. I think also that we need new tools of agency. We should not underestimate the power of language. I think the fact that we are here speaking to each other in non-African languages is a significant factor if we are to include ordinary people in African agency. We also have to think about the power of music in agency, how to involve the youth, how to convert their protests into positive agency. And certainly, I think, honestly, we need to identify African heroes that young people can look up to and can be role models for them. What I hope I'll have the opportunity to talk about, which I think should be my own contribution to the conversation, is the importance of African ownership and what that means. I think there is a difference between Africa's agency and African agency. I would like to talk about what ownership of agency means, because if the basis of ownership is not clear, the basis of legitimacy in agency cannot be clear. And the basis of legitimacy is not clear, then, as I said earlier, agency cannot be impactful. I think currently African agency is dissipated, it is weak, whether you're talking about Africa's relations, Africa's role in the world, or how Africa engages with others who have come to Africa. So on the one hand, Africa's role in the world, on the other hand, the role of the world in Africa. Both are reflecting a situation in which almost as if Africa is a what do you call it? An ingredient in the recipe of others. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, and for pausing on that very interesting question, whether we are an ingredient in other people's recipes or an ingredient in our own recipe. I'm not sure, Prof. But over to you.
What a little trap you sent me. Let me just address one thing that is obvious to some of us, but not always, the word agency. Agency is the ability to influence the behavior and the decision-making of others who are concerned about their inner national interest. And you cannot exercise legitimacy if you have deficit in introspection and deficit of leadership. When these two deficits are aligned, then you will be constantly invited to pull a chair to a table designed by others. So that's the first introduction. So just to demystify what we mean by agency, and Madame Teti gave a few examples of where there's a lot to work. However, I want to mention one positive example where it is possible to prepare for the exercise of that agency. She has mentioned, Madame Teti mentioned, that the African Union is the 21st member of the G20. And there was some positive stirring of ownership when the summit decided that the African Union's participation in the G21 will be totally financed by the African Union regular budget, not look for funds to pay for the trips. So when there is a will, there is a way. Of course, the African Development Bank and the African Import-Export Bank are lending ahead, but there was a decision that if we want not to participate as a recipient, but a shaper of the agenda, we need to get our first signal very clear. So that's by way of introduction. And I agree with my friend, Dr. Adeji, who said that we need to do things differently, and it is not up to the international multilateral system to make room for Africa. It's the opposite. And I want to mention three things. Since I have the timekeeper so close to me, she might end up nudging me, whereas my brother can get away with it. The first thing that Africa can attempt to do is interrogate the dominant hegemonic assumptions that have informed mandates and multilateral institutions, particularly in the areas of peace and security. And one way to test that as you have heard, Africa is the biggest regional group. No regional group has 54 or 55. So it has potential influence, and call for the reform of this fiction called the UN Security Council. It's a myth. It's not a Security Council, it's an Insecurity Council. It's a council not for collective security. It's a council for selective security for all kinds of reasons. And how can Africa do that? By invoking Article 109 of the Charter that says this United Nations Charter is not cast in stone. And every 10 years, go revisit it. The Secretary General has the high-level board that he appointed, and they recommended that that Article 109 be invoked with a particular focus on the UN Security Council. So here is an opportunity for the African agency to be exercised using the summit of the future. It should be the summit for the future, but anyway, the summit of the future to be an opportunity not for reforming or changing the Security Council, but for transforming. And Africa has had a common position on how this should be done. 2 permanent members with veto and few additional non-permanent members. However, there's a lot of criticism about that common position, given the abuse of the veto by the permanent 5. Adding more members permanent with veto is not necessarily the best way to go. So, to put it charitably, we need to revisit that. Another, I can assure you it's my last point. There is no way we can have global peace if we don't address the painful legacy of our common past. The past never stayed in the past, as you know. Any country that has not come to terms with their violent past is a violent country. A violent country that is always looking for security and feeling less and less safe. And therefore, there is a history between the continent and Europe. There is history between the continent and the US. That history left unhappy legacies that are still undermining our respective efforts to build together a more peaceful, inclusive world. And unless we address these, I fear we will continue to tinker with change. And it's a change and reform that will continually be co-opted by a dominant system. So therefore, the Africans have discussed this among themselves, calling for reparative justice. This does not mean paying me for the suffering I endured during the slave trade and slavery. It simply means that some of the ills that are afflicting me are remnants of misguided policies during the era of colonialism and imperialism. And therefore, when we say revisit the debt burden, we're not asking for a favor. So the Africans have met in Ghana and agreed on a declaration, a proclamation for how this reparative justice could go about. And therefore, it behooves the African Union, if it ever manages to muster the whatever remaining agency, to integrate in the declaration or in the pact for the future, which is the outcome of the summit of the future next, an item on this, put a seed in that pact for the future. Let us get together to repair the world together. Without healing, there's not going to be transformation of our relationship. So the anyway, I promised her I'll stop here. I won't go to my third and fourth point, but the idea is we need to revisit the relationship. A relationship that is based on partnership. A relationship that is based on the painful realization that what afflicts us does not stay in one place. What the climate change has done, which is a euphemism, the climate disaster, which is a result of the suicidal relationship we entertain with nature. And call it maladies or epidemics or pandemics. What they have done is they have democratized vulnerability. So it's not a favor that we revisit our relationship. An essential part of revisiting our relationship is to treat these 54 countries as partners. And they are not going to be treated as partners if we come with our wounds, our inner inadequacies, our inner deficits unchanged. Otherwise, in addition to the legal legitimacy that my brother talked about, we are suffering from performative legitimacy. Many citizens on the continent, the state for them is not a referent. Many of them are a bunch of citizens without a state. Why? Because of what he said, that it has been captured by elites, whether they are ill-elected or well-elected. So unless we address performance legitimacy or the deficit in our performance legitimacy, we will miss these opportunities we talked about, which is the Summit of the Future and the G20. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. And I hope you'll be able to tell us your fourth point before we conclude. But allow me to come back to all three of our speakers this evening, and try to delve a little bit more into some of what you've shared and said. And I'll begin with you, Madam Hannah Tete. You gave some examples of where there has been an expression of agency and the potential that lies there. Of some of the examples you gave us, which do you think demonstrates the most potential and can be built upon, especially where you spoke about a fundamental aspect of agency being also the views and the positions, the desires, the wishes of people, of ordinary people. You also spoke about the African Free Trade Agreement and the potential that lies therein. What are some of the prospects, and how do you think, in addition to what you shared, that can be propelled forward towards a greater expression of agency? Before you respond, I'm going to pose all the questions so that the other speakers can also have a bit of time to think and respond. Dr. Ebo, you talked about the elite-based agency. You talked about the need for people to be at the center of it, the gap between, first of all, regional and continental, that there isn't enough of a conversation, even as agency is expressed. But fundamentally, this notion around the gap between legality and legitimacy. Between the two, which would you say is more important and why? If one of them is more important, whether it's legitimacy or legality of this agency as it is expressed. And Prof, you ended on the important opportunities, the Summit of the Future, but also Africa's inclusion in the G20. But we heard, I think, from the other two speakers as well about this inclusion as just window dressing and how it may potentially lead to us losing some of the gains that we already have, and some of the gains actually of being outside of that formation. What would you say are some practical ways in which to harness the potential or the opportunity that is presented by the AU being a member or representing the whole continent? And how do we include the voices of ordinary Africans? So, Tete, I come to you first.
Thank you very much. So I think that in the examples that I gave, but I just selected 3, I could have added others. In the examples that I gave, the point I was trying to make was that whenever we have found ourselves in a crisis situation that requires solidarity in response, that has been a trigger that has brought African leadership together. But it needs to be more than just the leadership, because we need to find a way of bringing the conversation to all the other sectors of our society. We have elites, we have the private sector, we have academia, we have our young people who are itching to be heard and to be part of this conversation, and who have valuable contributions to make as to how we address these crises. So what I would say is that we should not wait to have this agency engaged on an ad hoc basis in the face of crisis. And that's why I argue that the African Union itself, and to add to the point that Dr. Adedeji made, the regional economic communities as well need to go through this process of revitalization, need to look at how they begin to be more inclusive of the other key stakeholders in our different societies, so that the agency is reflective of Africa in all its diversity. And I think that if we're not able to do that, and I do believe that we can do that, but if we're not able to do that, then we're missing out on an important part and all of the assets that we have in terms of the knowledge, in terms of the expertise, in terms of a very diverse human resource base. And also, I would include in that the African diaspora, because the diaspora is our strength, and they must be included in whatever we do as a continent. They don't, even if they live outside the continent, one of the features of our diaspora is that they feel incredibly connected to the continent, and therefore they have to be brought into this discussion as well. Now, when I was talking about the continental free trade area, when it was established, the idea was we wanted to create this space where we would be able to trade amongst ourselves. And it wasn't just looking at trade in goods, it was looking at trade in services, it was looking at the diversity of economic activity that happens in our continent, but to take advantage of scale. Because indeed, when you have 55 or 54 countries, I use 55 because the African Union says 55, but the United Nations says 54. So maybe I should wear my UN hat and become a bit more multilaterally correct. But anyway, whichever way you're looking at it, the whole point was to create an area where we would now be able to trade across a diverse range of situations where we hadn't been able to even have some of those agreements within the context of the WTO. And to use the opportunity to allow Africans to invest in our continent, but not look at our individual national markets, as small as they are, as being the constraining factor. And that's the reason why I talked about the importance of regional value chains. Now, it might be difficult for partners to conceive investing to create, for instance, the opportunity to create vaccines in one country for one country market. But if there is the opportunity to manufacture in a country for the continental market, without the constraints of having to deal with the challenges of multiple customs regimes and so on and so forth, then of course it can create a justification for that kind of investment. And so that's what it is supposed to do. But the challenge is not all countries have been able to domesticate the AfCFTA and the various protocols that have been agreed into their own national systems. So we don't have the same trade facilitation framework across the continent. And that is what has to be accelerated in order for us to be able to take advantage of the opportunity. the investments that have been made by Dangote in cement, by MTN in the telco sector, in other areas, say that indeed there is an African private sector that is alive to the opportunities, that has the appetite to take on risk that other external investors might see as being a deterrent to coming to invest in the continent. But the thinking was this platform would create the opportunity for them to be able to take advantage of that. And that's why I think it needs to be given more attention, and there has to be the understanding on the part of the countries that don't yet have sufficient diversification of their exports, not to see the AfCFTA as a threat, that South African manufactured produce will all of a sudden dominate the whole continent and the other countries won't have the opportunity to build up their own capacity. I think that there's an argument to be made for diversification, even of production in different centers. And I think that can be achieved regardless of some of the handicaps and the constraints at the moment.
Very good. Thank you so much. With the amount of nodding and mhm I heard, I think you've inspired several questions, but let us come to you, Professor Ebo, and then, but please, as he's coming in, for those of you who may have questions or a comment, please prepare them. We'll identify a few before we have to bring our conversation to a close. So please prepare them. You'll have about 45 seconds to ask your question, and I'll be quite strict with time. So please prepare them in the meantime. But Professor Ebo, over to you, please.
Thank you. I'd like to focus on the importance of ownership. But to answer your question directly, between legitimacy and legality, we have too much of legitimacy and too much of legality, and certainly not enough legitimacy, because the people are not involved. Legitimacy is the basis for impact and therefore sustainability. It necessitates inclusion. It necessitates active citizen participation. And it's only through that you can be transformative, as Professor Mahmoud was talking about. I said in my last comment that what I really want to focus on is ownership, because there is a gap, there's a difference between Africa's agency and African agency. And the question of what makes it African is where the ownership lies. And I want to offer a framework for a clear conceptual operational approach to ownership, so that if we are clear on what to expect when we say ownership, then we can put African agency to that test consistently. And I'll offer 4 elements. I think you would agree with me that if you are going on a journey, first you need direction. If we get in the vehicle and some say, let's go right, others are saying, let's go left, others are saying, let's go straight, that's going to be a very interesting journey. So for African agency, is there a direction? Is there a clear, common, cohesive, continental vision that drives this agency? Is it clear? Is it just the states and the elites with too little of the people? That would be my argument, that the vision itself has a deficit. But let us, for the sake of argument, say that the African Constitutive Act will be the basis for such an African social contract. Well, would agree, I think, that that vision is a bit blurry nowadays and needs to be sharpened. Silencing the guns by 2020 has become by 2030, God forbid, it becomes 2040. So how do we sharpen this element of an African social contract? So that the first element of that ownership of the African agency, what makes it African is that it requires an African vision. Within that vision, we have the very tough task of dealing with Africa's complex hybridity. The post-colonial African state exists side by side, sometimes in tension, with very resilient traditional customary African institutions. And we have to work out that mix for us to have a vision that reflects ordinary African people. Too often we're just talking about state processes, not people's processes, and we are not involving the traditional customary systems that actually forms a hybridity with the state formations. Within that, in bridging the gap between state and society is what you would normally call civil society. Our problem in Africa is that civil society is often not civil. It suffers from various elements of capture, some of which are similar to the state, captured by individuals who just claim to speak for civil society space, but are basically just aggrandizing their own personal agendas. Civil society NGOs who answer more to their donors than to their population. So civil society is, don't let's over-romanticize. It is essential, but problematic. But the first element of ownership is a common regional vision for agency. The second is a capacity. I won't take too much time, but Africans do have the capacity, but we need to organize on how we use the capacity to deliver. In terms of that capacity, the first thing that we need to engage in this second element is the narrative. The narrative of how we've come to be where we are is very important. We need to free our minds from some inheritances that we don't need to get into here. But just to say that the second element of ownership after vision is capacity. The third one is resources, and I'm not very popular for this. We should not expect others to pay for the African journey, and then we say we want to own it. You know, if you don't pay for it, it's just window shopping. So we have to be able to pay for for our dreams. Remember that we say in Africa that many African societies, the hand that gives is always on top. There's a particular political relationship that comes with being the recipient. So maybe take pride in what we have and don't expect Trojan horses from others. So resources that are ideally properly appropriated through legislative processes where legislatures can manifest oversight on national priorities, on continental priorities. These resources, third key element of ownership. The fourth and the final element of ownership that we need for African agency is the monitoring and the evaluation of that agency. You know, what is it that we are measuring? Who are those measuring it? In terms of what time space, what tools we are using must include Africans, ideally must be led by Africans. Too often, my experience is that it's almost like there are these messiahs who come from outside to award score marks the way you award to students about which African processes have been effective or not, while Africans are pulling the chairs for them to sit down. So we need to ensure that monitoring and evaluation are based on African energies that reflect African priorities. So to recap, a common regional vision for agency, the capacity, the resources, and monitoring and evaluation. A lot more could be said, but I think I don't want to be guilty of Professor Mahmoud's allegation that because I'm far away, the moderator is being kind to me. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we will find a way for you to pay reparations when we next see you. So Prof, over to you, please.
Before I answer, I'm a linguist by training. I came to peace and security by accident rather than design. And I'm still learning. They call me the unlettered practitioner. So one of the word that I'd like to take issue with is the word inclusion. We should include women, we should include youth, we should include, and when you prioritize inclusion over transformation, you know what happens. So let's revisit the word inclusion. Inclusion to what? As I mentioned earlier, to a table that's already set and decided by others, by men when it comes to women. Now, one of the things that I wanted, my fourth point that I wanted to share is that the exercise of agency is most productive at a time when the dominant system is under stress and collapsing and a new one has yet to be born. So all the orthodoxies and the monomyths that we've been inculcated, call it growthism or representative democracy, or is under stress, to put it charitably. That's the time to exercise agency. When the dominant system is exhausted. And we're not saying it's bad, it's just saying, let's put our horses together and together move on. Now, there are one thing that I didn't mention, and since I have a precedent by my brother, I'm going to abuse, but I promise you very short.
I'm so close to you.
Yeah, she's still close to me. We need to be careful not to throw the baby with the bathwater when we talk about reform in the multilateral system. There are institutions that need to be preserved and strengthened. One is the General Assembly, just to take an example, and the one is International Court of Justice. I won't say more, you are familiar with what is in a time of global stress, you need safety valves. Whether that safety valve will work, it doesn't matter. There is a safety valve. And we need to preserve in our attempt to. Now, how can the African agency be exercised with respect to the Summit of the Future and the G20? Two things. One, come with an agenda. And I'm happy to say the African Union, the last summit, agreed on the agenda, 6-point agenda. Second, come prepared at all levels, technical levels. And they have agreed on a mechanism for preparing themselves for active participation at the G20, in addition to the financing that I spoke about. Third one, don't overlook the role of citizens. I'm not talking about civil society or NGOs. By the way, when you look at the initial zero draft being prepared by Germany and Namibia as the co-facilitator of the Pact for the Future, which is 20 pages, now it's 242 pages, tell you how agreement is. The world civil society appears only once. Why? Because the majority, people call it global south, the majority of the world think that NGOs are Trojan horses for perpetuating asymmetries and power asymmetries. Right or wrong, that's the impression. And so, however, there is an agreement that there is an opportunity for citizen groups and stakeholders, as they call them, to contribute to the formulation of the Pact for the Future, which is the outcome of the Summit of the Future. And this citizen conference is taking place in Nairobi, May of this year. And the invitations have been far and wide. And so it's an opportunity not to be missed. And they are working on a people's pact for the future. So that is an opportunity to avoid all the excesses that we've talked about in terms of legitimacy, in terms of elitism. And it behooves, this is a test of African citizens exercising their agency. And if there are any relevance to governments in Africa, they better make it, and particularly the host country, Kenya, make it possible for that particular conference to come up with a truly transformative pact for the future that member states will have hard time to overlook, particularly at times of elections. You know how many elections this year. So that's my short answer to your question.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much. Let us open the floor for some burning questions, comments, and let's see if we can take 5 to begin with. And if we have time, we'll come back for a few more. So I see a hand over here, and then we'll come to Shreya, then to my brother here in the front. Are there any more hands? Okay, so those are 3, and then we have Dr. Besige. Okay, Van will be the last one. Please do introduce yourself and your affiliation if you're able to.
Thank you very much, excellent presenters. My name is Tony Chirabira. I'm a law lecturer at University of East London. And I just have one question because of time. Professor Mahmoud, you talk about transitional justice, but I would love to know how practical is this for a union? How do you see the African Union, a very political organization, starting to engage in repairing the past transitional justice? How practical is that? Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Hi, my name is Shreya and I'm a fellow on the ALC's MSc fellowship program. My question is, less, can the AU have a common vision for the whole continent, and more should it? I think when it's the greatest commonality is the shared colonial experience, but even if you look geographically, the distance between UK and China is less than the difference between South Africa and Morocco. So should the AU actually represent all these nations?
Thank you. Yes, that was number 3.
Hello, my name is Ruben Lendo. I'd like to say thank you for your presence today and for sharing your knowledge. What I really wanted to ask was, I believe that Africa has essentially, lost its values in regards to the progression of the continent. There's a saying that says, a country is built by its people. And I feel like Africa has lost that aspect, and they're now integrating the interest of the West into their own countries by causing conflicts amongst countries, which is done on purpose. So I would like to know, why has Africa, has lost its unity and its values, for a continent, for a different continent, which is unacceptable. Thank you. Yes, Ruben Alendo. Sorry, mine's Ruben Alendo.
Thank you, Ruben. I think we had, yes, it's for you.
Is Besige from Uganda. I think all the presenters seem to point to the question of loss of trust, loss of faith, loss of hope from the people towards those who lead them. And the report that Madam Hannah talked about, I think it was UNDP, indeed pointed to that. And you said that leadership needs to take notice of this report and change. We know that it will not change simply because it's shameful or it's immoral not to respond to this. And that is what Dr. Dideji, I think, was also referring to about ownership. So what you suggest will need to be done for this ownership, for this to change, so that the African states can represent, can have effective agency for the people, that the African Union or the multilateral level, there can be a stronger agency from the states so that it's effective for all of us in Africa.
Thank you. Behind Eka, there's one question. Barney, sorry, I'm prioritizing non-ALC people. We have one.
Hi, can you hear me? Yes. My name is Sanjoy Naik. I used to taught for a long time in the University of Birmingham and in Birkbeck, University of London. Now, I've worked quite a lot in the Horn of Africa for European Union, for World Health Organization, as well as in African Union itself. So, but in African Union, not for a very long time. Okay, that's my introduction. My first question to Dr. Mahmoud is that you want reform of the United Nations, Security Council especially, and you want to invoke 109. From your experience, can you please tell us what are the main impediments and who are the countries, those who are in the way of any kind of reform, which hasn't been reformed for the last 80 years? So that's my very quick question to you, sir. Madam Hannah, I just want to ask, as you know, that there should be a South-South cooperation, global South and South cooperation, more than the North and South cooperation, because the North and South cooperation for 500 years, we have experienced what happened. And also, I think, I'm putting it very, very politely, I think what should happen is that there should be institutional mechanisms within our African Union in order to have more South-South cooperation, so that there would be kind of transfer of technology and transfer of ideas, transfer of knowledge and things of that sort. And I didn't see any kind of transfer of technology that is taking place between South and South. And yeah, that's
Thank
it.
you.
Sorry.
Thank you so much. That is 5. I will, Eka, I know you want to ask about AFCFTA, but I think you can ask Madam Hannah afterwards. I will come back to our panel, and I will invite you to respond to any of the questions that you feel you want to, and also take the opportunity for your for any closing remark or closing statement. But yes, Prof, we can begin with you, and then Dr. Ebo will come to you, and then we'll end off with Madam Hannah. So please.
On the question of transitional justice, I did not say transitional justice. I said reparative justice, or as they say in the English language, reparatory justice. They're two different things, the transitional justice versus reparative justice. And this is not a taboo issue. It's been on the table. And as I alluded earlier, there is a declaration of last year, 2023, in Ghana that outlines what that means and how we should engage with the rest of the world on this issue of reparation or reparative justice. And by the way, I don't know how many of you have followed what's going on in the US. There's a whole wave of citizen and government movement for reparations. So it's not a new element. I'll give you another example at the interstate or intergovernmental level. CELAC, which is the group of governments of Latin America and the Caribbean, were invited for an EU CELAC summit. You know how Africa these days is a favorite guest to various capitals, from Asia to Europe, you know, constantly being invited. So one of them was last year in July, invited to a EU CELAC CELAC, which is and the Caribbean, Latin American wanted to put on the agenda reparative justice. Has two items. One is there has to be a recognition by the invitees that slavery and slave trades were crimes against humanity, number one. Two is that we need in our economic and political cooperation, particularly when it came to development and debts and so on, to take this legacies. Otherwise, Africa will always be, under the narrative that we always need aid, and we need money, and we need special drawing rights from the IMF, blah, blah, blah. So that's my question. The second one, we need to be careful in this discourse not to blame the West for colonization. If we want to exercise real agency, it's a historical fact. Colonization politically and otherwise has ended, but we still colonize up here. We recognize that. It's important to recognize that we continue to reproduce the tropes and the monomyths we've acquired, including in our governance system. True, but it will hurt agency if we can blame everything on colonization. Or, we need to decolonize this and decolonize this. So that is an important element. Trust. There are certain things in life you cannot have. They have to be given. They have to be earned. And trust is one of them. And we need to act accordingly so we can earn the trust of our people, but also of our partners. On the Security Council reform, as you know, there are legions of reports, but I will answer your question directly about why it is not moving forward after so many years on the agenda. First of all is power politics. When you have power, you're not about to give it up. And the Security Council historically has been creating to keep peace within the P5, not with the rest of the world. And as a result of that, people are saying, because it is now paralyzed, they're quarreling about numbers and seats and permanency. We need to revisit the dynamic and call for a different kind of reform. And so you will find all kinds of other new ideas about getting away from the veto and getting away from the permanent membership. There are all kinds of alternatives. In the meantime, there are the General Assembly and 2 permanent members, which people say they don't deserve to be permanent, let alone having the veto. You know whom I'm talking about. France and UK. Okay. So France, together with like-minded, there are so many like-minded groups in the General Assembly, put a proposal together with Mexico that has garnered the support of 106 member states, which basically said we should not use the veto when the issue is about genocide. More importantly, the General Assembly, while waiting for the reform of the Security Council, have agreed on a very important landmark resolution, which says every single member who has the veto, every single permanent members wielding the veto, they have to come to the General Assembly and give an account why they use the veto. So there are attempts to moderate this excessive until true reform comes through this review process through the invocation of Article 109 of the Charter.
Thank you so much. Professor Abel, over to you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, let me answer rapidly as many questions as I can. The first question on, can Africa have a common vision and should it? My answer is without that common vision, the African project is not viable, because the only chance we have is if we have collective African agency. Look at the European Union. The current situation is that, I think Fumi mentioned it in her paper, you know, the whole continent can be invited by, for example, Italy. We have the Italy-African Summit. And which countries? Russia-Africa Summit. You know, can you imagine the, I don't want to use the expression, the audacity that comes with that? You know, if we had a true union, I don't think that would happen. And this question actually reminds me, for those who want to think that far back, of the choice we made, the price of which we are still paying when we were confronted between the Casablanca route and the Monrovia route to African unity. We decided to take the long way home, and here we are. So for me, a common African vision is the only way the African project can be viable. The other question about what needs to be done for effective agency, I think I provided the answer. I think we need a clear framework, a commonly agreed framework that should be based on a common African vision, capacity, resources, and monitoring and evaluation. And if we take the resources element, there we'll see, I think, the value of what Professor Mahmoud is insisting when it comes to reparative justice. The current hegemonal order does not allow Africa the luxury of getting the best in terms of the global arrangement of production and exchange. But one would argue that there is some money that is owed the continent in terms of reparative justice, and that will help us to get those resources that Africa needs. Africa needs to depend on itself, including on resources, including on vision, on M&E, and so on. But let me add that you do not close your eyes because you don't want to see your enemies, because you don't know where your friends walk past you. African agency can also do with some allies. There are others out there, non-African, who have African progressive interests at heart. We need to identify the genuine ones and work with them. At the same time, we need to be careful and to know that not necessarily every African is a progressive. We have our own conservatives, our own reactionaries. We have to identify those as well, you know, and know how you put all that into the mix. But I think a clear framework for ownership is built around those four factors. The reform of the Security Council, honestly, is very important. But I think what is even more important to that is the formation of the African piece of that, the African. So I'm much more, honestly, at this point, worried about the very weak, the very blurry state of African agency. You know, what would happen? Let's even say the Security Council reforms happen. Is Africa in a position to take advantage of the opportunity that brings? So honestly, I'm much more worried about that African building block and the state, if you like, of the African Constitutive Act. I've heard it said, for example, that the African Peace and Security Architecture, APSA, is based, 2/3 of it is based on funding from the European Union. I haven't checked that. I don't know if it is true. But if that is true, that's a serious issue, especially if Africa is at some point supposed to be engaging the European Union in, say, trade policy negotiations. How do you negotiate with someone who is responsible for 2/3 of your continent budget? You know, so those are the issues that I think we need to confront first before we get distracted sometimes by the global element. Where, for example, is the African standby force? Is it colonization that is stopping that as well? Or our own lack of spine in terms of African security cooperation? So honestly, as important as Security Council reforms are, I think we should also not underplay the importance of putting the African house in order, so that when we engage at the global level, we do so on the basis of strength, on the basis of cohesion, on the basis of togetherness, because the other countries we are dealing with are coming together to have to form their own unions, so for me, African unity is sine qua non.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So we have to remember that this African project is a project of 54 independent, diverse nation states. And while we talk about African agency, it is because we recognize that in spite of that diversity, we do have our commonalities and our shared interests. Those shared interests are not confined to the fight against colonialism, which in any event, with the majority of all African states becoming independent at the moment, is a project of the past. That is not to say that we do not have a project of the future. And that is where our collective agency comes into being. But in order for that project of the future to be realized, there is the need to move beyond expressions of solidarity, to actually think about how that potential can be more effectively leveraged. Now, is it going to be leveraged by all countries at the same time? Definitely not. But the power of example is a very powerful example. And so we need to create that example, whether we're dealing with the issues of more inclusive politics and moving away, Dr. Besige, from the point you made about citizens as subjects as opposed to citizens, or whether we're talking about successful economic integration, even within the context of sub-regions, while at the same time creating rules within the context of the AFCFTA for a continental integration framework. So I think that what it is that we should be focusing on is acknowledging the diversity, acknowledging the different states of both social, economic integration and development, but at the same time, not using those as barriers or considering those as stumbling blocks to the integration project, but rather to focus on how do you create a coalition of the willing to make it happen. Now, to be a bit more concrete about that and to give a specific example, in 2016, the African Union was talking about a common African passport. I remember sitting in that meeting and thinking it's not going to happen in the next 100 years. But at the same time, there was a consensus that we needed to have greater opportunities for Africans to travel among our own countries in order to promote that integration agenda. So then the suggestion was made, why don't we have, or why don't we agree that we will give AU citizens visa on arrival? So they don't have to go through the hassle of having to go through an embassy and the bureaucratic impediments and so on and so forth. At the time, many countries said, well, for security reasons, we can't do it. But there were a couple of countries that said, okay, let's try it, Ghana being one of them. And in July of 2016, we said we're going to give all AU citizens access to visa on arrival to come to Ghana. Subsequent to that, you now had Ethiopian Airlines moving away from you must go to their embassy to get a visa to you can apply online and you'll also be able to get visa on arrival. For them, it was also a business decision. Ethiopian is the carrier that connects the continent. Now you've seen it with Kenya. Now you've seen it with others. So it's an idea that is catching on because they see the utility of it. That's what I mean by the power of example. We need more of those because the more that we're able to get a couple of countries agreeing we can do this and piloting it in different areas, I think the more that you see that others begin to see the logic of it. On the issue of inclusive democratic governance, it is also an area where I believe the power of example can make the difference. But that is the reason why, for countries that profess to be democracies, where government actually changes hands at the ballot box, we should be very jealous of and protect those institutions that allow that to happen. Because in a situation where term limits now become of no relevance, and people can just adjust as and when it suits them, and we decide that, as a matter of fact, we need to have more friendly internal institutions in order to be able to continue to have a particular regime in government. We're not just creating a situation where we are eroding the consensus on which our democracies are built. We are actually destroying our societies and destroying our opportunity to create that future for our young people. So I feel very strongly about the fact that democracies that call themselves democracies should not just do so by way of platitudes, but should make sure that those institutions are protected, are respected all the time. But, and this comes back to the African public square, I think that if we are able to create that as a vehicle, that is not just an academic platform for discussion, but really has, and that's why, you know, the structure and how it is going to be created is important. How does it link up with media? How does it link up with you know, create opportunities within the social media space? How do those conversations reflect an analysis of those conversations so that it becomes catalysts for action? All of that means that this has to be a very well thought through project to create that opportunity for that voice to be amplified in such a way that it will compel change. And that's where I think that you, as King's College, as the African Leadership Center, have the opportunity to make a significant contribution to making this happen.
Thank you so very much. I will not attempt to summarize anything of what has been said, but also just to acknowledge we had a few comments from participants online. Thank you very much for your participation and joining the conversation. Thank you very much to all of you who have been here, attentive, listening, and contributed to the conversation. But really, please join me in thanking our panelists for and he has promised to repair for some of the, you know, the mischief that he created while he was here. But we are very grateful for your time and for joining us from New Jersey, and we look forward to seeing you in person. Professor Mahmoud. And thank you for all your challenging comments and ideas, and of course, Madam Hannah Tete. Thank you so much.